Okay, some preliminary information to help get you going on Unit 2 on evolution. Well, there were a couple of other different theories out there about how things came to be the way that they are, especially referring to biologic organisms. The most prominent one was this by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He theorized that organisms were driven by an inner force towards greater complexity. But the thought that this complexity could then was that they could pass on this complexity that they acquired during their lifetime to offspring. Now, he based this on two observations that he had. He saw some individuals seem to be examples of use it or lose it. They seem to either acquire skills that they worked on, practiced, and developed, and then lose other skills or capabilities that they did not. He also noticed that some traits seem to be inheritable. However, this was later disproved. He used it as an example, for example, a blacksmith who was continually using his muscles and became a very well-developed muscularly, that his sons, some of them also were muscular, but that did not take into account that they maybe were helping in the smith shop, and again were developing their own muscles. And this theory was disproved, that if a skill or capability and anatomic difference was acquired during a lifetime, it was not heritable. Now, Charles Darwin, he set sail for a voyage on the HMS Beagle in 1831 as the ship's naturalist. At this point in time in history, many individuals, especially from England, Western Europe, were exploring scientists throughout the world. As part of this trip that he went on, he went to the Galapagos Islands, kind of off the coast of South America in the Pacific Ocean. They aren't close by any stretch of the imagination, but the closest large landmass is South America. Anyway, they arrived in the Galapagos in 1835, and he started looking at these animals. And he could tell, he really focused in on the birds, the finches that there were there. He could tell they were finches, and they looked similar to finches that he had seen on the mainland. However, they did have distinct differences. And not only were there distinct differences from the mainland, but each of those islands had differences from the other islands. And as he started to observe these birds, he could see that the beak differences were specific adaptations to different food sources that the birds were utilizing on different islands. For example, the finches that happened to use tools or twigs on one island would be very, very different than finches that only ate insects on another island. And as he came up with this chart, he noticed how many different varieties of finches there were, how many different beak shapes and food sources that they were exploiting, and the relationships between those. Okay. On this voyage, you can see here the little track. He pretty much went around the world, and for 20 years after this voyage, he continued to study plants and animals and their adaptations to their environment. He wrote about how species can change gradually over many, many generations as they became more and more adapted to the environmental conditions that existed around them. And he coined these terms about change in species over time. And as we discuss evolution, there are arguments out there that humans are descended from apes, and that is not accurate. Just like in this example here, the modern horse Equus is descended from Eohippus. If we had the full family tree here of like horses and other four-legged animals, you can see here horses are not descended from donkeys. They may have a common ancestor, but one is not descended from the other. So, in the terms of human evolution, humans are not descended from apes, just like apes are not descended from humans. However, we do have a common ancestor. You could think of it this way. I am related to my cousin who lives in Las Vegas, whose name is Jenny. Okay? We are related. I am not descended from Jenny, and Jenny is not descended from me, but we have a common ancestor. My grandmother and her grandmother are the same woman. And that's what evolution is talking about, common ancestors. Okay, it is dependent upon this principle of natural selection, that organisms that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore their genes will continue to be in the gene pool, while individuals that are less adapted to their environment will be eliminated either through disease or predation or some other means. In this little graphic right here, we're looking at some beetles. In this population of beetles, maybe the original color was green. The common ancestor was green. However, there may have been some kind of a mutation in some kind of generation down the line. And this mutation caused one individual, instead of being green, to be light brown or tan. Well, if this beetle existed in a desert environment where most of the environment is light brown in color, you could see how they might be better camouflaged. And those descended from the original ancestor that retained the green color would be more likely to be seen and consumed by a predator until the point is reached where there are no green descendants left. And only those individuals that have the inherited and then transmitted to their offspring, the tan gene would survive. Here's an example of some other adaptations. Most of these are in terms of look, but that adaptations could refer to the capability to be immune to certain diseases. In this, we have certain insects that are incredibly well camouflaged to look like leaves. Or in this case, you have one type of snake that has adapted to have a pattern that mimics a highly poisonous snake. And the last example is just to check and see if you're paying attention. Okay, factors that affect natural selection. Overproduction happens in most species, where more offspring are produced than will or can survive. In this case, the population will have a great pressure put onto it to have those best adapted be able to outcompete the other. The less adapted individuals, and those less adapted individuals will not survive to pass on their genetic information to the next generation. So this principle of competition between an overproduction of offspring is what Darwin called the struggle for existence, or it's also been called nature red in tooth and claw, meaning that yes, there is that competition and the fittest survive. Okay. Now, this natural selection is dependent upon variability. That there is some variation between those offspring. This will not work in a cloned population. If every single individual is exactly the same as every other individual, then there is no pressure on the fittest, because there is no such thing as fittest. And then only those that have that are most that are best adapted, there we go, best adapted to their environment will be able to survive and reproduce, to pass on their genetic information to the next generation. Well, that was a little bit of an introduction into evolution. We will continue this with our discussion next week in class, and I hope to see you then.